Right, do it.
Yeah. Hi,
Right.
everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Roger Luckhurst, whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of intersection between literature, culture, and the medical humanities. Roger Luckhurst is the Geoffrey Tilson Professor of 19th Century Studies at Birkbeck University of London. He is the author of several books, including The Trauma Question, The Mummy's Curse, Zombies, A Cultural History, and Gothic, A Cultural History. His new book, Graveyards, A History of Living with the Dead, comes out in October 2025. He's currently a research fellow at the University of Heidelberg in the Center of Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies, where he's working on a project about uncanny sleep states. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Luckhurst. Now I will hand over to you.
Thanks very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm coming to you from Heidelberg in Germany, which is a lovely place to be. And the Center for Apocalyptic Studies is fantastic place to be, and everyone there is completely bewildered that they got money to do this for 5 years. So it's been a great experience so far. I'm just going to try and share my screen if I can. I'm hoping that everyone can see that.
Yes.
Okay. Good, excellent. So, yeah, I'm talking today really about the interval, I guess, between life and death. And this is sometimes referred to in medical sciences as the gray zone. So I'm going to kind of work through some of the inhabitants of that, some of which you will be expecting to be there, but hopefully some of them you will not have thought about, or that are categories of being that you might not have considered, partly because it's such a um, rapidly changing situation, particularly in medical science, of what constitutes a living and a dead person. And it's really quite interesting area, has been in the 21st century. I'll explore that a bit. But just to kind of explain where I'm coming from, I guess. The title that I've picked in the grey zone is partly a reference to the book that this neuroscientist Adrian Owen has written. He's one of the leading practitioners of PET scans and fMRI scans. So he's mapping the brain with brand new emergent technology and finding rather alarming things, interesting things. And he wrote a popular account a couple of years ago called Into the Grey Zone, which he talks about as a kind of bizarre landscape full of strange kind of creatures and beings. And I'll talk about those a little bit. But if you're in the world of trauma studies or cultural history, the grey zone might also remind you of, and it's supposed to, Primo Levi's essay called The Grey Zone, which was in his book, The Drowned and Saved. And that's a sort of, he talks about the concentration camp. He was a Auschwitz survivor. He talks about the concentration camp as this kind of moral grey zone, but also a zone full of people who have really exited life or living, but are not yet dead. And he famously talks at great length about this impossible figure of the Musselman, as they were called in concentration camps. That is a kind of pejorative term echoing Musselman, meaning Muslim, because Islam means submission. So it's this idea of submitted to your fate. So you know you're going to die already. You have not got there. So you've kind of in this strange kind of state. They've exited language as far as Primo Levi is concerned. They've exited humanity really, but they're not quite dead. So he's kind of trying to speak on their behalf or trying to imagine their kind of status. And that's just an example of how we might kind of think across different disciplines about what the grey zone might mean. So that's also the place that I kind of wanted to inhabit as well. So in terms of medical humanities and medical history, I became really interested in this very important document from 1968, really transformative document that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in the summer of 1968. And it's by, as you can see here, hopefully, the ad hoc committee, so one that was just kind of set up in emergency, really, of the Harvard Medical School to examine the definition of brain death. And the first sentence of this very important 4 pages, which you can find online in full if you want to read it, our primary purpose is to define the irreversible to define irreversible coma as a new criterion for death. So it's these 4 pages that do something fairly astonishing. They do, in fact, redefine death. And what they're doing is shifting it from up to that point, you would medically define death as the cessation of heartbeat and the end, the lungs are no longer working. So the whole pulmonary system has shut down. And what they're arguing for is that we need to shift that now to a different criteria, which is to be brain death. And how they define that is that you have a flat line on an EEG machine. So there's no kind of activity in the brain that's being measured by the ECG machine. And this is a really kind of fundamental shift, actually, in how we might think about death, and it's going to do something very strange to this gray zone. It's going to create a new kind of gray zone in this way, and why they have to do that is of 2 really major shifts in medical history in the post-war era. The first one is what happens during the 1950s with a major polio outbreak. And as you know, polio virus attacks the muscular system really fast. And if you're unlucky enough to for it to get into the lungs, then basically it kills you in a matter of hours because it just completely paralyzes your pulmonary system. And what they did in the States and elsewhere, but mainly in the States, was that they invented a machine, the iron lung, which they kind of put inside, and they put the patient inside as quickly as they could. And this was a machine that artificially continued basically took over the muscle function of the lung, so you could breathe again artificially whilst they were fighting the virus. So it's beginning to separate out different systems of the body, and the pulmonary system can be stimulated artificially, whilst other systems can be treated, or actually even go into major crises themselves. And this is the beginning of a brand new word or brand new term that emerges in the 1960s, which is the intensive care unit. And if you've ever been inside one or you visited anyone in an intensive care unit, you know how kind of extraordinary and weird and traumatic it is. There's actually a condition called ICU psychosis because it's such a traumatic experience for anyone inside this assembly of machines, which is why you're largely kept in a sedated state. Because what it's doing is separating out loads and loads and loads of your different systems of the body and using them autonomously. So it might be, filtering your blood in a different kind of way. It might be artificially doing your respiration for you, all kinds of systems that are beginning to happen. This is a major advance. It's an incredible advance in technology, but it produces a problem, which is that you might be able to sustain pulmonary life, as it were, in a human being, so you can keep them breathing and they're working. But other systems are completely shut down, including perhaps the starvation of the brain, not enough oxygen. There is no prospect of someone waking up from that. Autonomic systems in their brain have been kind of shut down. So you've created now a space in which someone is both alive and dead at the same time. And the other impetus that is happening in the 60s is transplant surgery. And the famous case of Christian Barnard, a very controversial doctor from South Africa, uh, he became famous, world famous in 1967 for performing a heart transplant surgery on a human being for the first time. But it was had to be in South Africa because it couldn't be in America. Because if you did that in America, you would be immediately prosecuted for murder. Because what you've done, of course, is you've killed someone while their pulmonary system is still working. And if you're going to try and do transplant surgery, if it's effectively a fatal operation for the body you're working on, then you are going to commit murder. And there are some cases in the States where prosecutions were started, also in Japan, actually, as well. And Japan had a cultural taboo against transplant surgery for a really long time and was therefore decades behind other parts of the world, given it's an advanced industrial country. Tells you how important cultural context is for these kinds of things. Um, so if they were able to change the definition of death to brain death, what you could then do is say this body is still breathing and the heart is still beating, but this is a dead person. So therefore, we can harvest the organs and use them in our advanced science of transplant surgery. So that's another really kind of key impetus. It's given a really strong medical legal kind of drive to try and redefine the nature of death. So this all might seem a little bit arcane, but actually it feeds directly into popular culture as well. Hopefully you can see these. Oops, gone one too far. Um, yeah, so it comes out in popular culture almost immediately. So in 1968, the same year as this definition of irreversible coma, is George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. And that is a film which does something also very revolutionary with the category of the undead in the Gothic, which is that it shifts from heart to brain as well. So the way you kill a vampire is you stake it through the heart, but the way you kill a zombie is you shoot it through the head because you need to induce brain death somehow in this undead creature. Now, I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation. I don't think George Romero was particularly a keen reader of the Journal of the American Medical Association, but it's a really striking conjuncture. They kind of come together in a really interesting way. And about 8 or so years later, there was a very big best-selling medical thriller by Robin Cook called Coma. And some of you might have seen the film, although it's difficult to get hold of these days for rights reasons. But Michael Crichton did a version of this, and that's a conspiracy in a hospital where they are deliberately inducing brain death in a surgery so that they can then harvest the organs for profit. And that is a kind of very important late 70s film, remade also as a series, interestingly, in 2011, very different kind of vision of it. But it's worth remembering that Robin Cook was not only a practicing medical doctor, he was at the Harvard Medical School. So, in other words, he was kind of a colleague of all of these people who were thinking through a definition of irreversible coma. So he was right on the cutting edge and in those discussions about how you might produce this kind of new definition of death. And he was clearly thinking through the consequences. Okay, so in 1968, we have a definition of brain death. And in this first account, what they're using is the ECG machine, and they're looking for a flat line on the ECG machine. What's really problematic is that they keep finding very, very lively activity in people who are brain dead. Now they might not be waking up, but there are clearly this is not a flatlining kind of place. It's not an obvious sense that yes, this is complete inactivity. And ever since 1968, and ever since this kind of sense of trying to work through what brain death might be, there's been a constantly moving attempt, a boundary that moves about how you might define what constitutes brain death, because it's really very difficult to do that. And what consequently has happened since 68 is a whole new brace of beings that have come into existence. And this is just a kind of sense of running through some of these. So the term brain death was coined quite early in the 20th century in 1903. Um, but really, we're beginning to get the technology that brings this to the fore, that makes it something quite a common experience in traumatic brain injury, for example, that medics are encountering only after the Second World War. So you get a whole new set of terms and terminologies emerging. So the French tried coma dépassé, which means, I guess, the coma beyond coma, it's sometimes translated as that this is definitely a coma from which you are not going to awake. It's an irreversible coma. That's the term that the Harvard Medical School decide on. But then quite soon after that, you start getting proliferation of different terms. So the wonderful and so gruesome term of beating heart cadavers emerges in the late 60s. And there's also this term for people in this state called neo-morts, newly dead, but not quite dead, actually. So in this kind of liminal state. And that's just the beginning of a whole series of terms. So there's one very important medic, Fred Plum, who introduces quite a lot of these terms. So he's the one who coined locked-in syndrome, which is actually not a neurological condition, but is you might know this from the memoir, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, which was the one that was blinked out as a memoir because you're totally locked in you have consciousness, you're aware, but you cannot move your body and none of your systems function. But he had one muscle left in his eyelid, so he meant he could blink out a whole memoir. And it's very extraordinary kind of description of this interior kind of condition. So there's someone who's very, very lively indeed. It looks like coma, it looks like living death, but it isn't. It's a very rich interior life. And it's tricky, it's difficult. How are you going to be able to detect the difference between these things? Plum then began to introduce slightly different terms. So, okay, you've got lively register of activity in the brain on your ECG, but perhaps this is a persistent vegetative state, which is the term that he introduces in 1972. And then if that persistent state continues for over 6 months, you can start to call it a permanent vegetative state. And that's the kind of point where they begin to say, well, I think it's this point where you know that it's irreversible, where you can offer to the family or to those concerned. I think, if we turn the machines off, they're probably going to die a natural death. There is no coming back from this kind of state. It's purely artificial. It's a kind of torture for everyone concerned. Why don't we kind of switch the machines off? Is sometimes the argument. And as you know, this gets into really kind of serious medical dispute and territory of debate all the time. We've had several cases in the UK of this where medics and families or different groups have different positions on this. And it's particularly weird around the case of Anne Quinlan, which was a landmark medical case where the family really wanted, I think it was this way around, the family wanted to turn the machines off and the hospital would keep on. They then turned the machines off, expecting her to die naturally very quickly. And in fact, she lived on unassisted for another 8 years, but without ever kind of returning from a coma state, but nevertheless survive and support herself without being in an ICU for that kind of period of time. So these are really rare, vanishingly rare, odd kind of cases, but they're nevertheless, those are the ones that make kind of medical and legal kind of terrain. And I'm sure that you can all think of some examples that have happened recently, that they're constantly there in the press. So given that clearly there is some activity going on here and the ECGs are getting ever more accurate and being able to kind of detect quite lively activity. Some people are saying, is this a feedback effect of machines? We don't know. Better forms of scanning, deeper forms of scanning coming through with PET scans and MRI and stuff. You're beginning to see this what looked like a brain death as actually being really quite odd and lively. So by 1970, people are then beginning to think about, okay, so we need to define brain stem death because that's the autonomic systems that have to be artificially supported. So there might be cortical activity, but nevertheless, it's in the brain stem that there's no hope of coming back. So maybe that'll work. Well, it does kind of work, but you keep having to shift the criteria as the technology for detection changes, so that the people here are are in different kinds of states. So you see the shifting of criteria through the 70s. There's a huge presidential commission in the US on the definition of death, would you believe, in 1981. And that produces, through consensus in the medical committees, a uniform determination of death. And that becomes the kind of legal landmark for defining death in a new way in 1981 as well. But then I've just been looking at these quite weird discussions about what about minimally conscious states? These are states that there is definitely activity and even response, even language, even eye tracking, and responses that might include yes or no answers to things. But nevertheless, you are only defined as having minimal consciousness, a minimal conscious state, or SES. And that's beginning to emerge in committees and debates and disputes through the 1990s, where the new technology again is altering the boundaries. And that begins to include some really advanced states of dementia. And that includes quite a lot of people who are now being defined as in this grey zone. What kind of rights do they have? What kind of agency do they have? Anyone who's had a relative or a parent who's been through this. I mean, I have. My father was very suffered Alzheimer's right to the very end. Was kind of completely not the person that he was, but had really quite clear and sharp phases of responsiveness and re recollection, very sharp memories, and so on, right to the end. So that is that someone who's a living dead person or not? These are really kind of challenging areas. And in fact, some medical sociologists have been really kind of concerned about this increasing extension of the grey zone to include ever more people. Margaret Lock called this whole kind of area creating or constructing the good as dead. So, these are people who are kind of, in a sense, removed from human definitions into a state of what the philosopher Agamben would call bare life. They are merely kind of biological functions rather than conscious peoples. But is that right? Who has the right to say that? Who has the right to define it? And then Eric Kasdan, another medical sociologist, has talked about the already dead as a kind of category that's increasing and expanding, and is an area where the big pharma are very interested in treating, keeping alive and sustaining, but on very kind of expensive machines with expensive medical treatments. So there's a whole kind of debate at the sociological end as well as at the kind of hard science neurology end of this. So there you go. Since 1968, there's been a massive amount of shift and change in these states of being somewhere in the gray zone between life and death. Now, I'm a kind of literary critic and cultural historian, so these kinds of debates always make me think that I've seen this before. I've seen this for over 200 years of medical history and modernity, if you define that as something in the West that starts in the mid 18th century. It's always been accompanied by these very kind of strange beings, these kind of liminal states between life and death. And so, we tend to go to the Gothic for this kind of stuff. And here is the standard panoply of the undead that you would expect. So, going in order, historical order, vampires emerge. The first use of the word vampire in the English language is 1732 in the London Journal, and that's reporting a mysterious set of events taking place in rural Hungary. And that's a sense of here is a superstition or a set of superstitions that are held by the peasantry, that there are these people who return from the grave to feed on mostly livestock, actually, rather than other human beings in this initial set of accounts. So the vampire is almost immediately the Enlightenment arrives. In the 18th century, you have this kind of undead figure who's accompanying it. And it's always involved with medical kind of definitions of life and death. So that's why we have, in Dracula 1897, a whole panoply of different kinds of medical and legal experts who are trying to define what on earth a vampire is. So that's one. Frankenstein would be another, obviously, from 1818, Mary Shelley's account of this construction of an artificial being and its the inducement of life through electrical charge, which, as we know, Percy and Mary Shelley were very interested in and had seen demonstrations of posthumous nervous excitation in bodies, all that sort of stuff. So, there's another kind of case. There's also, by the late 19th century, a lot of mummy returns that are happening as well. And that is somewhere hovering between fiction and superstition and folklore and, a colonial kind of context. You only start getting vengeful mummies once England has occupied Egypt, and it becomes a kind of clearly a sort of narrative about an anxiety about colonial occupation and revenge. And then the next case, and the modern case that we've already talked about, the zombie, that's first used in the English language in 1889 in Lafcadio Hearn's work when he's been in the French West Indies. So he picks up this term. As we know, it comes from Haiti and from the slave plantations in Haiti. It's kind of a fusion of different religious beliefs in a very complex scenario. But the entry of that majorly into popular culture was through William Seabrook's extraordinary memoir of his journey to Haiti in 1929 called The Magic Island. And that was the text, it's even read out actually in the first ever zombie film in the States, White Zombie in 1932. Just worth observing that all of these films, these film posters, they all come from 2 years, 1931 and 1932. And most of them are in that, universal cycle. White Zombie was filmed with Bela Lugosi on Dracula sets. So, it's actually the same story, but with a different kind of context. So there's something there about horror film as it emerges in the 30s with this kind of catalogue of the undead that's also speaking to the 20th century as well. And then just, recently we've had a whole series of horror films and series that look at the flat line, literally the flat line of ECG and what it means to come back from that. So flatliners would be the famous text for that, but there are many others that we go to. So we've got the Gothic. Gothic does this for us. It's a place that popular culture works through some of these liminal, unnerving of the grey zone. But then, I mean, with the book that I've got coming out this October, I got really interested actually in a particular essay by an anthropologist, French anthropologist called Robert Hertz, who wrote quite an important essay in his late 20s before he was killed in the First World War in 1915. He spent some time in Borneo and also 2 years in the British Museum, another weird field trip, where he kind of collected lots and lots of information about funerary customs around the world. And because he was a student of Emil Durkheim, he became very systematic about this. And he came up with a thesis that has been influential ever since, which is that death isn't one thing. It's two things. So there's the physical death, the physiological death, but then there is also the symbolic ritual, funeral, departure, so the symbolic death as well. And what he suggested was that there is always a double kind of burial that's going on. So in between the physiological death and the symbolic death, there is this interval that opens up the space between two deaths, which is a term that was used in French critical theory ever after, actually. So it was picked up by Lacan. And if you're a Gothic person, you might know Elizabeth Bronfman's book Over Her Dead Body, which uses this idea of between two deaths consistently. So, there's a really interesting element here. Why I think it's useful is that basically different religions, different cultures have different intervals. And we get very either upset or freaked out or fascinated, gruesomely fascinated by cultures that don't kind of quite follow our own rituals of this. So, I mean, the famous examples in the Abrahamic religions would be, particularly in Judaism and Islam, this interval should be as short as possible. You're supposed to bury before nightfall on the day that the person has died. There are special dispensations to extend that, but it's not great. You shouldn't really be doing that. You also shouldn't be hanging around graveyards, and those are religions that don't really do, things in graveyards over the body. That's a very kind of a very quick element of the whole ritual. Christianity is different, and lots of different kind of extensions of this interval. But I think anthropologists get completely obsessed with very long intervals, cultures that keep bodies around for months or years and go through this very elaborate set of rituals. So when the Jesuits went into what is now Canada, up the Hudson River, they came across a tribe they called the Huron, which is a pejorative term for beastly, effectively. So let's call them the Wendat. The Wendats had these really amazingly elaborate rituals, and they would, stay with the bodies for a very long period of time. They would bury them, but only bury them temporarily. Each village lasted 10 years. At the end of 10 years, you would prepare a major ceremony where you would open up the graves and display the bodies in whatever state they were in these very elaborate kind of hierarchical kind of systems. The whole villages from around the area would come, they would trade, they would celebrate the dead. Then they would rebury them in these fantastically expensive ways, a year's worth of beaver hides and all kinds of very expensive artifacts, a potlatch, as we now kind of call them, using that term. So the Jesuits obsessively wrote about this. They wrote volumes and volumes and volumes about this kind of gruesome activity that they couldn't quite understand. And it's the same still. So you can go to Indonesia and to South Sulawesi, and there's a famous tribe there that it has the most elaborate rituals that go on for years to do with, the treatment of the dead. So, and it's a clearly a dark tourism thing. It's an exoticized thing. So these are also people who are living between two deaths and are in this grey zone as well, I think. So I found that idea quite useful as a way of marshalling different responses to kind of graveyard beings. So there you go. So I've been working on that a little bit, but then also, of course, historically, and you want a longer history, I think modernity has always been very freaked out, very concerned, very puzzled by sleep states, uncanny sleep states. Um, excuse me. So that's what I'll kind of look at over the next few slides. All of these elements have their own particular histories, I think. So the history of mesmerism, of artificially induced sleep states, has been very well researched, just because it's another kind of secret sharer with modernity. So in the 1780s, Franz Mesmer goes to Paris, having been kicked out of Switzerland, his home country, really, for these nefarious practices. But he has this theory of animal magnetism, which is that there you have the mesmerist who is passing, literally waving, passing his hands, which gives over energy to the patient, to your person that you are in rapport with. And basically, you are recharging them. You're the battery. You are recharging them with this physiological substance, which you can't quite see. It's invisible, but nevertheless is there, like magnetism itself. So there's a whole kind of uh, area of that. That becomes hypnotism. It's re-termed hypnotism without all of the stuff about actual physical transfer. Maybe it's just a psychological state that you can induce by suggestion. That starts in the 1840s, still very disreputable, still very much associated with Mesmer. And it's only in the 1890s, 1880s and 1890s that you start to get medics saying, we think that the hypnotic trance is an objective phenomena. We don't know what it is. We know that it's weird and uncanny, but we're going to try and research this kind of properly. So there's a whole kind of trajectory that you can take through that kind of material with mesmerism and hypnotism. And I'm happy to talk about that more if you have questions. But there are others as well. So through the 19th century, people were very interested, very obsessed actually with the sleeping Venus, which was almost like a fruit show performance or element that you would come across in big exhibition spaces or fairs that would travel around. And the most famous of these was Pièce's The Sleeping Venus. And this was you usually see these kind of figures in glass boxes. And the whole thing is this alive or is it dead? And I hope you can see from that image that this is clearly a waxwork. But you look at it long enough and it completely freaks you out. It puts you into the uncanny valley, because if you go and see it live, it is in fact breathing. So it has a kind of mechanical function where it kind of is simulating breathing. And that effect that you have on people with that kind of shock, that sudden sense of how Freud describes that fear of, I don't know whether this is alive or dead, is exactly what caused a big sensation with the Sleeping Venus. So it became a really major kind of celebrated event and toured all the way across Europe. Precisely this kind of automata, or this, kind of figure that you're not quite sure is alive or dead. And then also the fascination and pathologization of walkers and sleepwalking in the 19th century is very important. We could talk about that for a long time. Each of these have, considerable histories. So we could kind of look at those at length. What I would point out is that we have modern versions of these, each one of these actually still. So we've talked about the zombie being a kind of version of of the mesmerized figure, because in the first version of the zombie, before Romero changes it, it's all about hypnotism and all about control. So as you can see from the poster, they're in a slightly bigger form. What Bela Lugosi's evil priest of this cult of voodoo is doing is mesmerism. So he's kind of mesmerized the and captured completely the will of the pure white woman who's in danger on this Caribbean island, and it's through mesmeric power that this is really important. And that kind of comes back as well through things like Live and Let Die, the James Bond film, which has it's saturated in this kind of anxiety about Haiti and anxiety about um, the fear and danger that's taking place in Haiti. This because it's a world where horrific hypnotic control of populations is taking place by evil, dastardly leaders who've overthrown white rule and are now in command. It was very strong in the early 70s. It's very strong at the moment as well. This kind of ultimate chaotic place that is, feared and full of kind of strange superstitions and voodoo religions that exercise massive control. The Sleeping Venus is also something that was recurring in the 2010s. So some of you might remember that Cornelia Parker, the artist, got Tilda Swinton to sleep for 8 hours a day in a glass box in this case, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, but it was also in London at the Serpentine Gallery, I think. This is explicitly a return to the idea of the Sleeping Venus, of this gaze on a figure who is uncannily asleep in the wrong place, but also gives you voyeuristic thrill or power over the sleeping kind of figure. So that was kind of important. And then up to recent Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, which is almost entirely about sleepwalking and hypnotically induced states. And the director, Robert Eggers, has said explicitly he was using 19th century images of hysterics and of accounts of sleepwalking to get the full kind of representation of this in Lilias Depp's performance. So there is a kind of very up-to-date version of these much older forms. They don't really go away. They don't die away. They're part of the grey zone, part of the population that occupies this kind of territory. In terms of 19th century, though, the most famous of these and the uncanniest of these would be spiritualist mediums who fall into kind of trance states and then are able to communicate with the dead. And again, this is a vast field. Lots of people have worked on this, but here is an image of the very respected scientist, William Crookes, who is in his laboratory in Mornington Crescent in London. And there he is with the fully materialized spirit, Katie King. And behind the curtain, you can see behind this spirit lies unconscious in a trance state, the medium Florence Cook. Or so it was claimed anyway, because she'd been tied up, bound. It's all very perverse. And falling into a trance state, so she couldn't possibly cheat. And yet that trance state allowed her to direct her psychic energy, a term that William Crookes invented during these experiments, able to turn this into a physical manifestation of a spirit from beyond the grave. And that is a really kind of key event. He risked losing his entire very respectable scientific reputation on this. But curiously, William Crookes was a leading experimenter and discoverer of so-called dark matter, radiation, invisible rays in the 1870s to the 1890s. Very important in the emergence of radiation and all of those kinds of, Hertzian waves and so on. So for him, psychic waves were just another kind of hidden dark matter that you could detect, and that he claimed detected in his work. So there you go. Spiritualism is important. Psychical research also very important. So there's Frederick Myers, who was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research and was one of the leading researchers in hypnotism as it was beginning to be explored. Only he always thought the hypnotic relationship was also one that carried supernatural, potentially supernatural elements to it. If you're in rapport with someone, can you read each other's minds? This seemed to be what was being suggested all the way through mesmerism. Could they have heightened sensitivity? Could they see the future? Could they discern kind of at a distance? Remote viewing, astral travel, all those sorts of elements he was very interested in. And again, conducted experiments with very serious and respected scientists of the time. And it's this really interesting moment where hypnotism is fully uncanny, but also potentially fully canny as well. So you can kind of determine it through scientific investigations. So those mediums and those subjects of psychical research experiments were another set of people who were in this kind of gray zone, suddenly living bodies that were able to be vessels for the dead as well. And this is all in this context of lots of medics, neurologists, biologists beginning to try and discern these kind of elements of strange states somewhere between living and the dead. So the main image here is of Jean-Martin Charcot, who was a famous French Paris-based neurologist, the most respected neurologist in the European world, who every Tuesday would do these lunchtime demonstrations of usually women, not all, but usually women, who would fall into kind of trance states at his powerful suggestion, and then go through a series of ritualized kind of gestures or moves, because he was trying to define the hysterical state as seeing this going through neurological kind of pathways that he was determining. He obsessively photographed women in these various states, and this became a way of documenting people in trance states who nevertheless are doing very odd, weird performances in this kind of strange state between living and dead. It's very kind of uncanny. Everyone talks about the uncanny state of trance. Now, is it physiological? Is it neurological? Is it psychological? Is it psychosomatic? Is it psychogenic? That is, physical but caused by psychical states. All of this was a kind of, area of contention. Charcot was someone who was a neurologist who wanted a physiological explanation for this. But one of the people who went to see his work in 1885 was Sigmund Freud. And Freud would come up with the idea that actually hysteria was purely psychical, and that famously, as his communication says in 1892, hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. In other words, it's a memory and a psychical issue, not a physiological issue. Very contentious kind of statement to make, much contested at the time, and explored in different kinds of ways. But there are a whole set of terms that are beginning to emerge in the late 19th century to try and categorize these weird trance conditions. So you would have dissociation, which was Pierre Janet, another student of Charcot's. He would say that this is something to do with memory chains and traumatic effects, shattering memory, turning you into personalities that you could cure by putting people into hypnotic states and forcibly suggesting or altering their memories to happier ones so that you would kind of quickly erase their traumatic state. The term catatonia was coined for this as a physiological state in the 1870s, but that soon became subsumed into schizophrenia by German theorist. So that's a kind of German term that's emerging in the late 19th century. And then to go back to France again, narcolepsy was defined in 1880, and that was seen as a neurological condition, which it is. So it's only in the last few years that people have defined or discovered why certain people have these micro sleeps or fall into sudden states of sleep at certain emotional triggers. And this is it's a neuropeptide problem. It's a neurological problem that is not a psychogenic state at all. So, you see lots of gradations, lots of kind of odd, uncanny people in this gray zone beginning to emerge in this phase of medical history as well. I'm nearly at the end of what I'm going to say, but I just wanted again to bring it up to the present day and just sort of talk about how we now are obsessed with our sleep health, aren't we? I don't know if any of you are wearing your Fitbits that measure your sleep and that are kind of documenting your the quality of your sleep and your rhythmic circadian rhythms and how much slow wave sleep you're getting or how much REM sleep you're getting. But all of these terms are very kind of recent, very new. REM sleep was only discovered in the early 1950s and named then. You're only getting people arguing about, is there a 90-minute circadian rhythm in the late 50s in these newfangled places called sleep disorder clinics. And now we have over 75 sleep disorders, I believe, that are treated by a massive industry in the West, huge pharmacology associated with this. But also, I've called this the biopolitics of sleep because there's lots of interest in certainly in military area to explore whether soldiers in fact need sleep. Can we biologically alter or inject them with things that would mean that they could keep hyper alert, or indeed workers could keep hyper alert? That's a key problem for various industries as well. How do you keep people awake and in the rhythm that's demanded by the capitalist system of work? So there's loads of material on this as well. And there's just some books that I've been looking at during my fellowship here. And this comes through into uncanny states in popular culture as well. So you think about, the Matrix, there's the blue pill or the red pill. Take the blue pill, you fall back to sleep, you're back in the Matrix, or take the red one and wake up. So that sort of that's been hugely influential in all kinds of good and unfortunate ways. So normally it was about ideological demystification, wake up, but now that sense of wokeness is used by the right, appropriating a term from African American culture and consciousness raising culture to kind of demean and diminish all of that sort of stuff. So, in a sense, they're arguing don't be woke, stay asleep. This is not what Get Out argues for. Get Out is full of these kind of fears of hypnotic control and of manipulation in racial terms as well. The brilliant film Sleep Dealer, which people should know more people should know about, a Mexican film about Mexican workers who are put into kind of trance state conditions and then work remotely through in America, in effect, through their prosthetics. And that's a sense of the exploitation of others through this kind of form of manipulation is a really brilliant version of it. And some of you might have seen the Korean film Sleep, which came out last year, and that's a very kind of comic version of this obsession with sleep disorder clinics, where the husband who sleepwalks at night is repeatedly taken to a sleep clinic, and it's only the shaman that realizes, of course, that he's possessed by the spirit of a man wandering around their flat. He lived in it before and needs an exorcism. So there's kind of, this clash of different versions of self and sleep. And that's got some really good uncanny moments in it, actually, of people acting out strangely in this vacant state as they sleepwalk. I just wanted to mention very briefly at the end, though, that also there's a whole other area of this that we might think about, which is very different. So this is disease entity where diseases cause people to fall asleep. And during the Spanish flu in 1918, and also during the Russian flu in 1890, um, there was another epidemic inside that epidemic, which caused people to fall asleep and largely never wake up, or else they were in this stupor. And that took that for a third of the people who got this disease, they never woke up and they stayed asleep for decades and decades. It was called in the end encephalitis lethargica in the First World War. And that's where all of these people who Oliver Sacks discover in his famous book Awakenings in the 1960s, 40 years later, he finds this whole array of people in the New York medical system who have been in stupor for 40 years. And he injects them with dopamine. They briefly wake up, they have this awakening, but it's not enough to change the massive physiological damage that's been done by this mysterious disease that no one knows whether it even is a disease. Its status as a disease entity is really uncertain, and it feels a little bit like, I was interested in this during COVID lockdown because you have a COVID epidemic, but you also have what's happening to long COVID, what's happening inside this disease. We've had this before, and we've had this in kind of really quite alarming ways. And the description of symptoms of long COVID sometimes is of torpor or stupor, brain fog, all those sorts of elements. Is this a standard kind of doubling or echoing of influenza or of viral epidemics? I won't do that one actually because we'll run out of time. I'll quickly just suggest also that we can think about trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder as also another state of being beyond life and before death. So it's quite often in culture felt that the soldier who goes to the front, who goes to the battle, has basically visited a world of death and is returning from the dead. This is there in Homer's Iliad, isn't it? When Patroclus, can't say it, is kind of begging for his soul to rest because his body has been left on a battlefield and he needs to be buried properly with the appropriate rites. And so Achilles promises that he will go through the ritual. There's a very elaborate description of his burial in order to put his body to rest. So that fear of dying on a foreign battlefield and not finding your way home means that you enter this kind of space. And this, of course, happens to modern veterans as well. So that's Don McCullen's famous image of the shell-shocked soldier from the Battle of Hue, 1968. No one quite knows who that actually is, but it's this sense of someone who's been through such a horrific experience that they've been numbed and, in a sense, left as a kind of deadened kind of creature. And we are really aware of that as kind of veteran. The image of the veteran has kind of circled around that idea ever since. The person responsible for traumatic stress disorder as a term is Jay Lifton, and he talked about people after Hiroshima or after battlefields in Vietnam entering a world. They live in a world of death, absolutely saturated in death, and that therefore these are kind of voyages out from a world of death. And it's striking, very deliberate that one medic who treated Vietnam veterans, Jonathan Shea, wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam. So that's echoing back to Homer and that kind of sense of it. And you get horror films about Vietnam veterans who are literally undead, returning. And that's Bob Clark's amazing film Death Dream, which is extraordinary. And I would recommend if you have a strong stomach for 1974. One last image, I think, which would be this idea of the necropolitics of war. I'm using Akira Mbembe's term necropolitics. So you have a biopolitics of life. You also need a necropolitics, he suggests, of death worlds, and these are increasing. And in a way, our recent wars, the Iraq War and so on, has been very interested in looking at these kinds of states of post-traumatic stress or of states of suspended animation. Um, there are versions of this that the filmmaker and photographer Tim Hetherington did. So he embedded with troops in Afghanistan and this whole series of images called Soldiers Asleep. They're at their most vulnerable, but also at their are they uncannily anticipating death? Or is Tim Hetherington, the photographer, uncannily anticipating his own death because he was killed on service in Libya in 2011? And again, is the war photographer someone who's also um, compulsively visiting these kind of death worlds because the whole cultural representation of war photographers is really interesting from that point of view. And then you also get versions of this from the other side. So I think um, some of you might know Sadawi's amazing book, Frankenstein in Baghdad, but also the Syrian writer Khalid Khalifa's Death is Hard Work is an extraordinary book about a family trying to take the body of a mother home to bury. And this is just a kind of hugely extended kind of journey through a war-torn world, increasingly kind of dangerous and lost. In other words, it's a rewrite of William Faulkner's I Lay Dying. So we're still kind of in this kind of terrain of death worlds in the kind of war situation. I have other things to say, but I should stop now because I've gone on long enough, and I'm really happy to open to questions or observations or anything that people want to say. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to you, Professor Roger Luckhurst, for your thought-provoking and deeply insightful and inspiring talk. I think your exploration of this complex and often unsettling space between life and death has not only illuminated the cultural and medical narratives that shape our understanding, but also challenged us to think more critically about medicine and cultural practices that govern this liminal terrain. And I'm genuinely looking forward to reading your new book, Graveyards, A History of Living with the Dead. So now I would
Mm.
like to welcome any questions and comments, but I first need to stop the recording.